The topic today is navigating the future of higher education marketing. So what we're going to be covering today is we'll kind of frame the topic, talk a little bit about why we feel the subjects that we're going to talk about are important, the kind of drivers of the things that are that we see as trends, particularly for prospective students. We'll talk about some of the strategies for success, and we kind of identified 5 areas. There's obviously more, but five areas we hear about a lot in our own interviews with students, in our own kind of research, what we see. So we'll kind of try to summarize some of the things that we found. And then we'll talk about taking action. I certainly attend a fair number of webinars and training sessions, and it's always helpful when we don't just talk about the things that we see, but also how you can actually take the next step and things you can actually do to practically take action if you want to make improvements, for example, to your website. And then we'll have a chance for a Q&A. We'll also have a poll partway throughout, just to warn you in advance to be mentally alert for that, just to give you a chance to interact a bit as we're going through the discussion. So with that, I'll turn things over to Paul, who will introduce himself.
Sure, I'm Paul Gilzow. I'm a developer relations engineer with Platform.sh. Before that, though, I had 20 years of experience with the University of Missouri as the lead developer for their marketing and communications division.
Great, thanks, Paul. And Paul and I have a very similar background. I worked for 15 years for the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, as a web developer, team lead, and as an instructor as well. And for the last 7 years, I've been working for a company called ImageX. We build websites primarily for nonprofit and higher education institutions. So we're going to talk a bit about some of the things that you can do to make a strong digital marketing experience. Particularly, we're going to focus on prospective students, and I think that makes a lot of sense. It's mostly what we hear about people wanting, not the only thing, but obviously a big focus. So some of the current threats that we see is obviously declining enrollment. I say across all sectors, but it is uneven. There's some sectors that are more successful than others, but certainly like something that causes anxiety, we'll say. Along with that, low commitment, and this is before the pandemic and increasingly now. People are applying to a lot more institutions. There's less of an emotional attachment. People aren't necessarily applying to the same schools as their uncle or their parents or whomever, and they're shopping widely, put it that way. And then finally, cost concerns. We actually conducted a number of user interviews to prepare for this, and it just came out loud and clear that people are very sensitive about price. They're concerned about what they're going to get out of the experience, and that's just something that comes up over and over again. So knowing that, the terrain is uncertain, and there's so many different sort of, pitfalls out there, and those aren't necessarily going away anytime soon. What we thought we'd talk about today is a few things. We'll talk about some key focus areas. We'll focus on 5 of them. What we hear from prospective students, and also we heard from marketers as well, based on our experience. We've worked on a lot of projects. Also a survey that we ran. You can see a little bit of a graphic from it to the right. Just asking, for example, students, how easy is it to find the information that they're looking for on the institution's website? And then also we ran some new research, some user interviews in preparation for this, just to get a little bit of a sense of if what we're preparing is what's relevant for students. So we'll share some of the results of that. We'll talk about some strategies for addressing those areas, and then we'll talk about our thoughts on how to both assess where you are right now and to take action. So the 5 areas that we're going to focus on are addressing cost and value, making it easy to self-serve. So that's something that we see not just in higher education, but across the web is, people want to lurk as long as possible. And then suddenly when they're ready, they want to be able to take action. Emphasizing support, something that comes up a lot, especially since the pandemic. Highlighting diversity and inclusion. And then finally, making it easy to reach out when needed. And that kind of goes hand in hand with making it easy to self-serve. People want to find information that they need without intervention easily, but then they want to be able to reach out at the right time. So the first one we put first, because it's obviously the one that's often top of mind for people, is addressing cost and value. We put those together because it's a common thing for people to talk about cost in isolation, but in fact, they're 2 pieces of the same puzzle. If we address cost and just help people understand how the financial planning aspect, but we don't help them understand why you're a fit for them, we're leaving something on the table. So cost and value are top of mind and need to be addressed, really, really assertively and proactively. And that's one of the big points is the value needs to be clear. Walking the student through how this supports your future, how long is this program going to take? What kind of outcomes can you expect? All those different things, kind of like the guided kind of pathway to their future. And then also explaining things like offsets, like aid. We can present them with a lump sum cost, but often there's ways they can offset those costs. So help, for example, showing them average cost after aid is very, very helpful, and ideally quantified in some way, not getting into the weeds of the details right away, but giving them a good understanding of what they can actually expect to spend.
And particularly in the States, education and higher education specifically has had a bit of a rough patch. It's under kind of an attack PR wise. So it's important that you don't shy away from that when you're talking about costs and values and ROI, is that you address that head on and really showcase how you're going, your institution is going to assist potential students in their pursuit of education at your institution.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the key points that we see is, making it hard to find the cost is one potential error. And the other potential error is information dumps of cost, where you haven't kind of like provide people with a scaffolded, guided way to understand what they're looking at. So I think that's one of the key points is your site can help students and families, because a lot of people might be involved in this decision, make sense of the information, not just presenting it, but designing it for them. It can show how aid can help with affordability. And you can also use your site to show value. So for example, here 56% of Trinity students graduate with no debt, kind of helping people understand that, we're here to support your goals, not just to sort of hit you with a large dollar bill. And then the last point, which we mentioned before, is just not overwhelming people with detail. We heard that over and over again when we do user testing. It's probably not surprising, but it's a good reminder that people are very eager to get the nut graph, the quick gut sense of something before they're ready to commit and dive in. So averages and estimates are okay. So this is an example of Bob Jones University, and the way that they walk you through tuition and cost is it's almost like story-like. They help you understand how we can help you afford your education, offset with things like grants and scholarships. They help you understand how you can access aid. And they also help you understand like the average amount that a student gets in terms of financial aid. So this is not like a cost calculator. It's not a PDF filled with like, endless statistics and every single cost for books, but it gives you that sort of immediate sense. So, kind of progressively giving people the level of detail that they need is so critical. The other thing, and maybe just before I move to that, the other thing is it makes it very easy. If you want to, you can go in and click on the net price calculator and really dive into the detail. But the first view is not nearly as detailed. The second example is from Southern University. And these examples resemble each other a lot. And there's a reason for that is, really strong design often follows really kind of consistent patterns. So so for example, in Southern University, it's really kind of graphical. It's almost like hitting you in the face with things that are very visually obvious. They really support that kind of 2-second scan. So out-of-pocket costs are very clear. Even like the wording is very plain language. It's designed to speak in the way that you would think. It's laid out in a simple way. It presents clear next steps, which it's a little bit hard to see here at the bottom, but there's actually CTA. So it's not just leaving you with an impression of cost, but telling you, okay, now that you understand this cost, maybe talk to financial aid or find out, ask an advisor, whatever those steps might be, but not leaving people stranded without a next step. And in general, the copy is not just designed to be scannable; it's designed to be friendly, fast, and helpful.
One thing real quick that I'll mention is that one thing that we did often was we would, for a page, we'd identify the key takeaways that we wanted a user to leave with. And Bjorn mentioned earlier some user testing as well as that 2-second rule. And that's what we would do. We would show someone that hadn't seen the page before for only 2 seconds, 5 seconds, a very short amount of time, take it away, and then ask them to write down exactly what they remembered from that page to see if that key takeaway information was actually conveyed. So again, those are great examples that he just showed of doing that, of saying, here are these key pieces of information we need. And we'll get more into user testing, but it's a very, very good ROI to gauge if you're able to make meet those goals that you've set out for these areas.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And that sort of leads us to some of the tips. And some of these tips actually came directly from some of the students we talked to. So some of the key ways that you can kind of guiding principles in building out this page and in other types of content like this, as well as providing pathways so a prospective applicant see the cost relevant to them. Maybe there's specific cost for veterans or specific cost for other groups. And we want to make sure that we're not giving people noise. We want to give them signal. Trying to avoid information dumps. I kind of mentioned that earlier, but we've all seen it. Maybe sometimes we're guilty of it ourselves, is pointing people to a PDF and it's emotionally impactful when you see users see that and their journey stops. It stops cold. You can imagine on a mobile experience for sure, but even on a desktop, often, if people are presented with too much information, it will literally stop their journey entirely. So starting with another key point is starting with a summary, but making the deep dive accessible, providing an obvious link to the cost calculator. So people will want to dive in at some point. So don't make it too simple, make it possible for them to crunch the numbers. And then finally, providing contact information for relevant departments. That actually came up in several of the interviews we did, was people said, okay, I get it, now what? So making sure that we don't just present people with an impression, but give them a catalyst for action. So this is just one of the quotes from one of the interviews we did with Hyene, was if the content isn't organized, I get frustrated. It needs to be simple. And these are things we know intuitively about ourselves even,
right?
But so easy to forget.
Back to those basics, right? Back to the basics. Good IA, good user experience, but we often forget and kind of stray away from those. So, yeah.
Exactly. The second kind of element that we hear a lot from the research and from students is making it easy to self-serve. And I mentioned before, this is not just in higher education. This is a trend across all industries. Increasingly we're all lurkers. Even people, you may not even talk to them in the application process. They may end up kind of successfully applying without ever appearing to you. So if we want to break our anonymity as a user, we'll tell you. So give people the information that they need in order to make a good decision and compare, because they're going to be shopping widely, as we mentioned before. But they're going to talk to you and they want to talk to you. So knowing that, it's one of the key things that we can do with a website or any channel where we're presenting information, social, whatever it might be, is it's important to prioritize the key student questions and some of the basics of good UX. So clear labeling, and not just on the main tray where we have like student life, academics and admissions. That's easy, right? We all have that. But thinking through the next level down and thinking through the page as well, clear headlines, really, really tight, concise copy, bulleted out, and resisting the temptation to go too long on your page. We all want to tell our story, but students they'll read that story when they're ready. We'll put it that way. So, concision is good, and also good search. That's user and SEO friendly, and that can be searched in both ways in terms of making your site Google friendly or Bing friendly, possibly. But also making it the internal search better is a huge opportunity that often falls out of a web project.
As an example that I'll give, at the University of Missouri, the phrase residence halls is banned. You're not allowed to say residence halls. But the third top keyword search for the entire University of Missouri was residence halls. And so for years, we had this disconnect between what people were searching for and what was being found in those searches, because we weren't allowed to use the words that they were using. Now, at the University of Missouri, there was a complicated process where we ended up getting our own Google search appliance and then key mapping and all of that stuff. But again, going back to the basics of, if certain words are being used to search for from your population for those prospective students, you need to make sure your content is using those keywords so they can find that information. Another aspect with search is there will be prospective students that, no matter how good your navigation is, will go directly to search. And that's just how they've been trained. That's what they're used to. They're going to go there. And Bjorn, in talking, he had an example of searching on biology. And the first result was an event for a biology-based event from 5 years ago. That's not the first result you want. The first one you want is your department or your college of biology. So you've got to make sure you're constantly checking your content and making sure you're using the keywords that you want to rise to the top of those results.
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. And I know we're spending a bit of extra time on search, but I think it's a good thing to focus on, because not only is internal site search, like the site search on your site, important, but also like the way that you construct your like metadata, the way that you organize your site is going to heavily influence if Google even finds you at all,
Right.
and what page it finds. So investment into that is one of the highest ROI activities you can do. And if you're wondering, where to start, and obviously there's a lot of elements to that of coordination internally with IT and marketing and various things. But just writing out some simple scenarios of I'm a student looking for this thing, and can people actually find it? So that kind of brings us back to user testing. I know we're hitting that fairly hard, but it's what the reasons is because it's relatively easy to do.
Yes.
And we'll talk a bit more later about some ways you can do it. And the impact that you get from it, the ability for that to catalyze the organization to action is disproportionately high. So this is an example just to the right of a project actually we worked on recently, just last week, where the client had a thorny challenge where students they weren't able to find important dates. They looked at admissions and they looked in about 20 different places, as you can see from this tree. So that was one of the things we learned from user testing. Some of the recommendations that helped address this were including CTAs in relevant spots that kind of jumped out a bit more, cross-linking from different sections, just to help people funnel down and to help avoid those cul-de-sacs that people were falling into. So one of the examples that one of the students shared with us was from New Pals, where the page is simple, but it's simple largely in a good way. So this is the admissions page. It allows people to self-select relevant pathways. It chunks the information in manageable pieces, not like a eye-popping design, but very clear, laid out in a step-by-step way. And that's really what people are looking for is, feed me the piece that I need to make the decision. Step 1, step 2, step 3. So, obviously a huge element of strong user experience is just thinking through how much do we need to tell right now. And that brings us to our poll, our one and only poll of the webinar. And the question here is, how recently have you taken steps to improve experience for prospective students? And the options were, we're currently focusing on it in the last 6 months, in the last year, or more than a year ago, or never.
Thank you for participating in our poll. I'm just about to end it now. So if you still need to get your answer in, I will give you 5 more seconds and then I'll share your results.
So never. It's always a good time to be rethinking how you can improve that experience for prospective students. I've been to a lot of higher ed conferences, and a common theme is not enough money, right? We don't have enough budget,
Yes.
we don't have enough time.
No time, no money.
And so one of probably the best ROI I ever saw or experienced in my 20 years in higher ed was those user testing, especially with students. You've probably got some swag sitting in a closet somewhere, and it's amazing how students will react. If you put out a poll or put out a request for students to come do some user testing, just an hour, and offer some swag, it's amazing how many students will be more than willing to come in and sit and walk through some sites of yours to give you feedback, and will gladly give you feedback. They want to be heard in a lot of cases. And so you can do, 1 or 2 students in an afternoon, 3 or 4, for definitely less than $100, and get thousands of dollars worth of information back. It's a huge ROI.
Yeah, that's absolutely it. And there's, a lot of things stop people. One of the things is, a common belief is that you might have to hire a consultant, spend $10,000 or $15,000 and develop a really rigorous test protocol. You can, and that's valuable, but you can also have a guerrilla testing session. It used to be pizza that we offered. Now we can offer remote pizza maybe. And the other thing is, typically after 2 or 3 sessions, you start to see those patterns right away.
Yes.
You don't need 10, you don't need 20. Sometimes you just need 2 or 3.
Absolutely agree.
Thinking about some of the practical takeaways that we've heard, kind of wisdom from the users, some of the things that really viscerally bother people. And it's something that we do in higher education a lot. So hopefully I don't offend anybody, but avoiding stacking navigation. It really can confuse people, especially if we have a link in more than one place. It's a common temptation. We're like, oh, we have something, our staff directory, we'll put it here, we'll put it here. But it's one of those things that stops people cold. They say, which one is it? Are they the same information? Which navigation do I go to? Do I go to the thing for students or the thing for admissions? So carefully thinking through, if you're going to have more than one way to get to things, making sure it's obvious what the main way to do it is, and keeping the second one very, very secondary. Second one is
that quote's a great example of choice overload, right? We often mistakenly think if I come up with all the different ways for someone to get to my information, I'm serving everyone, I'm serving as many people as possible. And instead, what we've done accidentally or inadvertently is we've created choice overload where someone sees it and then freezes up because they don't know where to go. And so, as you said, the best thing to do is to give those guided paths instead of 1,000 different options. Give just a couple guided paths to get them directly, to guide those users to the information directly that you need them, or that they need, that they're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of goes to some of the other points here, which is, it's a trend. It's not necessarily a great trend. It's not just in higher education. You see it all over the web of like super long pages that talk about every aspect of your value proposition. And when you see students' faces, when they see pages like that, you will know what the reaction is. It's usually not positive. And, it's very much about, web design is very much about making sacrifices, thinking about what do people really need to know at this point in the journey. Those pages often even feel less overwhelming when we've got our big workstations in our offices. They're much more challenging when we've got a little phone view. So just thinking about, what do we actually need to tell people at this point? Less is more. Don't overwhelm the page with content, announcements, and stories. Colorful, and by that I mean like useful, kind of interesting information about events and such, very helpful. But there's a point where we need to pull back. The other piece is that content is designed. They're absolutely intertwined. They're one and the same. We can't just tell people things. We need to kind of graphically present it in a way that is obvious and clear and avoids, because people are lazy, they don't read. We're all like that, we know. And then the last one is top task first, designing pages and navigation around goals. It's always a challenge. If your site was designed 3 or 4 years ago and it was designed by committee and it was according to the needs of the organization and not users, one of the challenges, okay, what do I do about that? I strongly encourage people, look at what you have through these lens and think about some of the quick wins that you can achieve now. Even reducing a content on a page a day or a page a week is going to be beneficial to you. So the first two kind of strategies that we talked about are mostly around user experience in the classic sense of like traffic control, or like how do we get people from A to B in an easy, fast, and appealing way. The third piece is about something different. It's emphasizing support. So the need for support has been increasing for years, and that's obviously a big term. We can kind of break it down a bit. And the need has only grown more acute. So this is an example of a survey done by bestcolleges.com, where the majority of respondents report difficulty in participating in class, difficulty meeting peers, and difficulty completing homework since the pandemic. So there's a lot of anxiety out there. So the question is, obviously the website cannot hold a hand. There's limits to what it can do, but there are things that it can do very well. So we know that extra support is required by many students. Needs are very various. Could be counseling, mentorship, academic support, support for students with disabilities, a variety of things. Make it easy to find that information. Put it in not just one place, but put it in places that make sense. Maybe in admissions is one of the places that might be quite relevant. Emphasizing the ease of finding services and, so in general, integrating it holistically into the site. So this is an example here of a community college where they actually have a section in their navigation that is strictly about support, how you can be successful. It's called the Succeed section. Whether you do that or not, it kind of points in the right direction. This is the top thing that is top of mind for people. Help them overcome that anxiety that they're naturally going to feel by kind of proactively talking about it. And also the response, shouldn't necessarily just always be reflected on the website. It should be reflected in the channels a student use, whether you have a TikTok or a Instagram or whatever that might be, or for Facebook, if for those who still use Facebook, ensuring that we're helping people understand we've got your back. So this actually does come up quite a bit when we talk to students. Some of the examples of kinds of support that students would want to see would be support for people with disabilities. Actually comes up quite a bit, even when people themselves are not disabled, they want to see that. Funding support, so costs are very stressful. So not just psychological support, but funding support, and mental health support as well. So Janet, one of the students we talked to, said, most students are enduring a lot of extra stress from academics in life, especially since the pandemic. Show me that you got me, because I'm going to have trouble at some point, probably. And I'm trying to think about this whole 2 or 4 year journey, help you understand how this is going to work. The second element that's not directly related to user experience, but is very much part and parcel of the experience of the site, is highlighting diversity and inclusion. So students evaluate an institution on a lot of things. The authenticity comes up a lot. It's a common word these days, but it's obviously really relevant to discussion about diversity. So you can see actually to the right, Earlham College showing this range of organic shots of student and campus life on its Instagram page. Yeah, that's really really good and really meeting students where they are. But a key point with diversity and inclusion, something that we heard a lot with students when we talked to them is, your story is out there. People can go to a variety of sites. Obviously, they can talk to their peers. They can go to sites like Niche and top colleges and all these different sites. They're going to find out where you are. So being authentic and honest about your story is really, really important.
Well, and students, this next generation of students especially, have grown up being marketed to in every aspect of their life, right? And they've become acutely aware. And so authenticity, as he said, is crucial. And so the last thing you want to do, as they're going through your different mediums, they're going to Instagram, they're going to Twitter, they're going to your Facebook, et cetera. You've got to make sure that messaging, that voice, that diversity, you've got to truly believe it and showcase it everywhere, because if it doesn't match up, it's going to seem inauthentic. And it would be better to do less than to do more inauthentically, right? So it's got to be a wholesale adoption across the institution, and it's got to have support from top down so that students see that you truly care about diversity, you're truly making waves. And just like previously, address it head on. Don't hide behind, I think he's got 3 students in a tree. Don't hide behind it. Don't avoid it. If you've got shortcomings, say that. Say, we've made mistakes. We make mistakes now, but we've got plans in place and we are trying to improve the diversity, the inclusion across our institution. So don't hide behind it, address that head on.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a message that when we talk to users is very appealing to them. We're not perfect, we're getting there. That was absolutely unacceptable and a message that people really wanted to hear. But beyond that, acknowledgement is fine, but they want to see some action, like want to know about your recruiting efforts, want to see that there are maybe events on campus that highlight, do we have an event around Black History Month? Do we have actual supports for people with disabilities? All these different things. Another thing that comes up quite a bit is, can we give people support quickly? If I have a specific need, is it going to be I'm going to be waiting for months to have it addressed? So a lot of these things, they very much come down to telling the story that makes sense for where you are right now, and as much as possible. Obviously, you're beholden to an institution that has its own reality and its own culture, but there is a story to tell, and it's one that's absolutely, it's one that people are going to find regardless of whether you tell it directly or not. So this is an example from Hunter College, and this one of the users we talked to, Janet, pulled out this example herself. She said, "I really like this. This is a college that she's looking at." She liked the way that photography and stories kind of naturally weave in diversity, so it felt very much organic. That it wasn't demonstrative, but it felt just like part of their identity. But beyond like just pictures, the campus life itself clearly showcased diversity. The stories were, were very centered on inclusiveness. Campus initiatives highlighted diversity, and it just felt like it wasn't just talk, and that was something that really appealed to her. The last point that we're going to make is more UX related. And this is the final one we're going to talk about, which is make it easy to reach out when needed. So we talked about self-serve, but also it's important to make it obvious how to find things, find people, all that stuff. So one of the key elements of successful institutions over the last couple of years, you hear this a lot. It's kind of like a student by student approach. And of course, that's something that can't just be done entirely through digital channels. That's also something that requires like institutional support and resourcing. But the website and the digital channels can support that quite a bit. Presenting people with a personalize however we want to interpret that. So whether we're just helping people segment themselves, or whether we're kind of presenting pathways that are kind of helpful and right for that person to help people to navigate. So presenting people with kind of guided pathways is helpful. But another really helpful thing is presenting people with like a degree selector. I'm interested in arts in some way. Can you help me find, a program that works for me? Guiding students through the process as much as possible. We can accomplish this through, good, thoughtful web design. But at some point, we also want to make it very obvious, easy for people to reach out. So clear, good CTAs that help people reach out to the right person are very, very helpful. So I mentioned a kind of a degree finder or a major or minor finder. This is an example from Arizona State University. They do quite a nice job meeting people at various points in the journey. Some people don't know what they want to do. Some people are very sure what they want to do. So it even has a game that allows you to kind of quiz yourself to understand, am I more inclined toward science, or am I more inclined toward the arts, or do I want to explore both? And that really brings us to the point is we can self-serve a lot, and then we can customize only when needed. So we're not being inundated with basic questions. That's also a sign that the site hasn't really succeeded in presenting people with a good packaging experience. And we work on a lot of higher education projects. A very common thing people ask is, "Hey, can we put a chatbot on our website?" Not just in higher education, in lots of different industries. And it might be better, unless you're very well resourced, to start with making the website user-friendly and self-serving and helpful. And then if you're going to be implementing something that involves personalization or actual humans behind, that's a fairly significant initiative, and one that usually comes after a deep dive into user experience.
Yeah, it's often, especially with these types of things, it's better to not do something than to do something poorly. Right? Especially we're often sold, especially in higher education, we're always sold the next new shiny thing, right? Like, oh, here's this AI chat box that's going to be able to answer everything. And the last thing you want to do is implement something that really doesn't meet the goals. It really isn't what the students are expecting, and giving them a poor experience right out the gate. So especially again, considering the financial constraints the higher ed's under, it's better to do less better than to try to do more poorly.
Great, thanks, Paul. Yeah, and also, so we've covered some kind of broad ground in terms of the kind of points that students often bring up to us. In the next section, we're going to talk in more detail about some things you can do to actually catalyze action. So I'll go through this like relatively quickly, because I do want to make sure there's time for questions as well. So some of the additional kind of considerations around this is, the deeper we go, kind of like what Paul talked about, the deeper we go into like high touch, the more that requires time, cost, and long-term investments. Rapid change can require a lot of coordination, and cultural change is gradual. So often the best thing you can do, rather than start some new initiative, is fix what you have, fix what you have right now. And that kind of brings us to the last piece of this webinar, which is, if you have a desire to do something better with your site, how do you go about doing so? Like, what are some ways that you can build buy-in? What are some ways that you can kind of assess where you're at? So if one of the primary goals is to respond to users' needs, we could say students or parents or donors, whomever, we focused on students today, we need an approach that's going to result in a meaningful, sticky change. So some of the things that kind of build that change include a clear understanding of the problem. If we can't articulate the problem succinctly and well, it's unlikely to change. An understanding of the constraints and impediments that we're under, budget constraints or people constraints, and a business case for action. So all of the things that we're going to talk about kind of are intended to do all those things: build a business case, catalyze action, and assess where you're at. So the first one we talked about, we could probably talk about this one enough, but asking users, we can reach out on Craigslist, or we can put it out there in the student union. There's a variety of ways we can talk to maybe some volunteers that are current students that we work with. That's a very common approach. Getting together maybe 3 or 4 or 5 students to road test your site, or potentially if you have wireframes that you're thinking about, testing those as well. Providing students with key tasks is really helpful. So that's what we did when we did these user interviews. So find important dates related to upcoming admissions for 2022 or 23. But it's also very helpful to focus not just on tasks, but to have a free-flowing discussion where you ask students their impressions, what they like, what they don't like. If you just focus on tasks, you might have a very efficient site that isn't very interesting. So it's very helpful to probe in. It's also extremely helpful to record the sessions if the student is comfortable with it. In some cases, you might be talking to minors, so that's a consideration. It's probably good to have a good waiver form available. But if you can record these sessions and include them in a package intended to get buy-in, it's very emotionally impactful to see a 30-second snippet of someone struggling with your site. Another approach that's complementary, these aren't mutually exclusive, is conducting internal research and workshops. Very common approach, and it's very helpful as well. So some of the things that can be done include like conducting a review of your site, review of competitive sites, talking to stakeholders and gathering their needs and requirements, and gathering, gathering strong examples across the web. Could be in higher education, could also be outside higher education. Folding that kind of activity and research into an internal workshop to drive consensus and buy-in. And there's a lot of considerations with workshops like that. You want to keep them smaller to start with, instead of including 30 people. And focused topics are better than general. So you might want to have a workshop maybe on a specific section and improving IA for a specific section. But nevertheless, combining these two approaches, talking to users and starting to talk internally, it does start to catalyze the case for change. And that, I guess, brings us to the third point. The reason I put it last is because it's often really useful to do the first two first. Before you talk to a consultant or a vendor, you don't always have to do that. There's a lot of teams who have the capability to do this on their own, or maybe you're in a pretty good spot. You're just looking to optimize. But if you do seek to engage a vendor or curious about the possibility, it's often useful to have a good idea of what you want the outcome to be. So presenting the vendor with the problem is very, very helpful. And instead of saying our RA is terrible and our design isn't very good, maybe helping them understand the specific problems that you've uncovered, very, very helpful. It's often, I'd say, useful, and this isn't always necessary, but it can be quite useful to consider engaging a vendor that can also fix the issues. So it is very common, we see it a lot, where somebody spends $10,000 or $15,000 on a report. That report is reported and then sits on the shelf for weeks, months, years, and kind of demotivates the organization. So if you're talking to somebody who can assess the issues, make recommendations, and then actually work on them, that is often a wise decision to find a partner. It also might be useful to ask if that vendor is willing to help prepare an internal pitch. And that might be during a project itself, or maybe before the project. If they can help you succeed, that helps both of you. And then the final one is, we do see this a lot as well, because we work on a lot of projects, is being careful not to go too far down an unsupportable road. If you're successful, you get a vendor, maybe you put out an RFP or hopefully not, maybe you've put out a bid for $49,499 just to get under your RFP limit. And you've managed to secure a great vendor. Just being careful not to go too far down an unsupportable road, and building out designs that you're not sure if you can implement, or engaging in an agency that maybe isn't as familiar with the technology that you work within. All those things. Just being careful about how much you're asking for at any given point in a project.
I'll piggyback off that. And I've been responsible for numerous RFPs and RFP processes, and higher ed is a bit of a slow dinosaur, right? I mean, it can take 6 months to a year from beginning to end for an RFP process. So I would caution to make sure that you're also looking at and selecting vendors that are flexible, because where you start right now you might not have the same problems by the time the RFP is finally awarded. You might not have the same problems a year or 2 years down the road, and now you've got a 3-year contract with a vendor that can no longer support the new challenges that you have. So you need to try to evaluate and select, vendors that are able to shift and become real partners with you, not just a vendor, but an actual partner that really is invested in seeing you succeed and is willing to go and change and flex with you as your needs and requirements change.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I work a lot in the vendor side because we are a vendor. One thing I would say about it is, it's often very valuable not just to ask for references from a vendor of clients that they had a great project with. It's really helpful to ask for references of a vendor of people they're still working with 5 years later, and how that worked. Because, you know, for a lot of vendors, you know, a very understandable model is they work on projects, they're large in scope, and then tend to move on. So just thinking through, doing your diligence in terms of finding somebody who's going to be able to support you over the long term. So the last piece we want to say about this is just some expected outcomes from these approaches. There's value in just knowing where you are, even if you're not able to move yet because of the sometimes glacial pace of higher education. Just understanding what the current issues are. Maybe even some of them you'll be able to address internally, or maybe all of them you'll be able to address internally. But knowledge is power. Knowing where you want to go, so making some recommendations about what to update. Understanding, you know, where the bodies are buried and where the pain points are is very, 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 very helpful. And then, you know, having a phase plan. Maybe there's some quick wins that you can do right now, or maybe you've decided after looking at this that you need a wholesale change and there's no point investing further in what you have right now. But the more you know that, the more you're able to make informed decisions. And then finally, of course, like if you know where you're at, if you know what the problems are, and you kind of have a path forward, the business case is a lot easier to put together. And the business case can include the pain points and the way forward. It can also include some emotionally impactful things like quotes from users or other pieces that help you know, provide clear evidence of some of the issues you're seeing. You can also use analytics and other things, but there's a lot of value in an emotional case to be kind of complemented by a logical case. So those are all of the, that's all the content that we want to share with you folks today. Now we'll open the floor to questions.
Well, I would say my hope, you know, if you do nothing else, is to go back and interview one student. Take advantage, you know, you've got an institution, you've got a lot of students. Try to go back and interview one student this next go around as you're looking at implementing a new page or a new IA or whatever, just to give it a go. Because you can use that then as justification to get some budget to do additional user testing. I know we struggled for a long time to convince our administration to give us the extra funding to do more user interviews. And eventually the piece that won them over was a recorded session, kind of Bjorn, as you mentioned, where we saw a user struggle for 30 seconds to a minute, trying to find information and showcasing that to an administrator and saying, look, we need to make changes, but we can't make changes if we don't know exactly what's broken. And having them sit and watch that poor student really get frustrated was eye-opening for administration. Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah, that's a great question about how do you build a business case. So, I mean, we talked about a couple of things already, and Paul, you might have thoughts on this too, but you know, we talked about some of the fuel for that, and we see this. Okay, one of the things we see commonly in well-written RFPs. So a business case has been made, it's successful, it's out there, and you're finding a vendor. Is, you know, we have done some work already. We conducted stakeholder workshops, we conducted maybe some user interviews. That's not always the case, but at the minimum, we have a good sense of our needs. That helps obviously build a case internally. Tying those needs into specific anxieties and pain points for the institution. These issues will harm enrollment. You know, these issues will harm donation, whatever the kind of top anxieties are for the organization. Putting that business case together, because you're going to hear a lot of patterns very quickly, it often doesn't require like a huge investment where you're talking to 30 or 40 people. You're often able to talk to a few people positioned in key areas like admissions or what have you, who are able to offer insights that immediately provide obvious value. I guess a couple of things I say about business cases is keep it brief. You know, especially if you're talking to stakeholders who might, or leadership or somebody they may be pitching to, keeping it concise, brief, impactful, and focused on statistics, graphs, and the bottom line is very, very critical. And then the last thing is, if you can prepare some estimates of how much this will cost, a common thing that happens, you have a beautiful business case, but no idea how much this is going to cost. And then, you know, the institution loses interest very quickly. So vendors are often very happy to help you understand the rough costs of things. And that's something that, might be better to get sooner rather than later, especially if you have some information on the problem itself.
So on the next question, Christine asked, they're getting ready to go down the path of user testing. When you conduct the video, what was it through visual testing design? I know for ours, we were testing wireframes, trying to gauge the information architecture and redoing some of those pathways. As far as an impact, it definitely had a direct impact. We were able to take the current site, the tested iframes, evaluate what worked and what didn't, and immediately make changes to those wireframes, that IA, test again to verify that there was an improvement. And then we were able to show, again, showing administration, here's the current state and what we saw students and what they struggled with. Here's the revised state and the improvement and how they're able to get to that information. And then using Google Analytics long-term, we were able to showcase, okay, now people are actually getting to these pages that we wanted them to get to initially, but weren't. And we've seen a distinct increase in the number of visitors to those places.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of that question too is like how we can gather user testing virtually and how we can find prospective students. So like a common thing that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it has some weaknesses is user testing current students. Because obviously the challenge with current students is they know you, they know who you are. True. And it's so that it's not necessarily a reason not to do it. It's better to do that to do nothing for sure. But it is very useful if we are considering, do we have a good message? Is our site easy to understand? Do you even understand what you're seeing? To talk to some people who don't know anything about you. In order to do that, one of the ways of that quite a bit, it's going to sound cheesy, but I'll say like Craigslist, you can hire expensive recruiters. Sure. For example, like userinterviews.com is one. They do an amazing job. They'll find you like all kinds of segments. You say, I want to find a mix of genders, 17 to 19, looking for higher education. There's nothing wrong with that. If you've got the money, perfect. That's a great solution. Absolutely. There's other groups like Optimal Workshop does the same thing. They do I've worked with them before. They do a fantastic job. It's pretty cheap. I don't know, it's like $10, $15 per user. So not too crazy. But you can do it yourself. It's the need, because you're not looking to find executives or people whose time is constrained. These are people who generally are open to talking. You can typically find people quickly. I put an ad out, for example, on Monday, and by Tuesday I had 30, 40, 50 responses. The knowledge is waiting for you. It's out there.
It could even be as simple as the child, a high schooler of a friend of a friend of a friend, right? It doesn't have to necessarily be even somebody you don't know at all. You can utilize your network to find high school students or, freshmen, sophomores at other universities and ask them, ask their parents if you can borrow them for a little bit or pay them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's always good to be sensitive to providing some compensation. Like if you're providing people with nothing, I think that could leave, a less positive impression in that person's mind. I completely agree with minding your network. My daughter is actually, I've been involved in a number of different user tests, and that works really, really well. So you're finding prospective students, they're 100% out there. It's useful to have maybe a little bit of a screener to vet them. So, because if you put an ad out to find prospective, some people are professional user testers, and they'll say whatever they have to say to get on that list. So it's helpful to say, like, maybe tell me a little bit about your background and why you're fit for this test. The next question here is, what is the best way to get championship from above? Any suggestions on that? We talked a little bit about sort of providing the business case, but yeah, I don't know if Paul, if you have any thoughts on that. I had maybe a couple.
I mean, going the cheap route first, just to get some base information to showcase again, this can make a difference. We had a student worker, we had them come in and we tested it. We were able to identify some stuff. We had we grabbed another student. They did basically the same thing, and we were able to make a change, and it made a difference. And then taking that back and saying, okay, we've done the cheap route, and it gave us valuable information. Can we now get some budget? Can we now get some not leadership, but some support for investigating this type further? again, start small. You don't have to eat the whole thing, right? Like you just got to take a little bite first, just some little piece first, and show how that has assisted and made an improvement. That's going to help you get that funding, that support from above.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's also helpful to do some gaming out of the people that are who hold the purse strings.
Oh,
What do they
yeah.
care about? Who are they? What do they care about? I know for a fact, like some of the people we talk to really care about numbers. Some of the people that we talk to, they really care about the impression of the university, the reputation of the institution. So if you can understand like a little bit of the personalities, like at the LinkedIn, research, honestly, that is super valuable. We find that all the time. Another thing is knowing what the budget is. If you come to someone with a $10,000 or $100,000 ask, and they have no idea how to find the money, that's going to be less effective. So if you can understand a little bit about how what the operating budget is and what the allocation of is for this, even just asking, that's very helpful. Often you can engineer projects to go within a specific budget bucket. So if you can ask, okay, well, what if we put this into operating expenses instead? It's a much more respectful conversation. When you're coming with knowledge about who the players are, where the budget lives, you're going to have a very different conversation than someone coming to you just saying, hey, we need, we have these problems on our website. What do we do? It feels much more like a peer discussion. I guess the last thing I'd say about that is also like two drivers that can be very useful. Numbers, obviously big, very, very big. If you can present like these things are not working well and here's some numbers to buttress it. And also showing what competitors are doing. Good competitors are doing, there's often a high level of sensitivity, especially in the upper echelon of leadership, to see, we're not doing that well. And our site is underperforming. I think that's another driver that we see quite a bit.
Yeah. So again, if you have any further questions, again, the slides are going to be available. I'm super easy to find online. I have a very unusual last name. So if you search my last name, you will find me or my brothers, and they can get you back to me. So I'm super easy to find. We'll be more than happy to answer any follow-up questions you have, as well as the slides are going to be available. And the presentation was recorded, so it should be available later as well.
Thank you, everybody. I hope this was
Thank you.
helpful. Appreciate your time.